Okay, great. Um, so welcome everyone. Thanks for waiting there just a few minutes. And thanks so much for being here tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hearing tonight's reading and discussion between two fantastic authors, Casey Parks and Claire Dederer, in conversation about the release of Parks' new book, Diary of a Misfit, a memoir and a mystery. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina. We're an anarchist collective that specializes in titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. Firestorm is also a community event space. However, due to the ongoing pandemic, we continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. With that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. This month will feature titles that spotlight facing the climate crisis through ecological revolution, building a participatory economy, living life without a state, and original horror from writers of color. So if you're interested in signing up for those or any other events through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I will drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. And for those of you who are here tonight attending in the live audience, our speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you're interested in asking anything at any point, I'll just encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen, if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the Facebook live stream. Great, moving on to tonight's speakers. Casey Parks is a reporter for The Washington Post who covers gender and family issues. She was previously a staff reporter at the Jackson Free Press and spent a decade at The Oregonian, where she wrote about race and LGBTQ+ issues and was a finalist for the Livingston Award. Parks lives in Portland, Oregon. And we also have Claire Dederer, who is the author of Love and Trouble and the New York Times bestselling memoir, Poser, My Life in 23 Yoga Poses, which has been translated into 12 languages. A book critic, essayist, and reporter, Dederer is a longtime contributor to the New York Times and has also written for The Atlantic, Vogue, Slate, The Nation, and New York Magazine. She lives near Seattle with her family. So Casey, Claire, thanks so much for joining us tonight all the way from the West Coast. And I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Casey to start.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I do want to just shout out Claire's book, which is so good. I was just rereading it. If you don't trust me, it also has Cheryl Strayed blurbing her, so very good. We were just talking before. It's a little more racy in a good way than mine, so I really recommend it. I am going to read a few pages from the beginning. So most of my book takes place from 2009 until 2019, but I actually learned about this story 7 years earlier, and so there's a prologue, and that's where this is. A few months after my pastor asked God to kill me, my mom ran to the bathroom, and I ran after her. She shut the door before I reached it. I knocked, but she didn't answer. The rest of our family was in the dining room, eating spare ribs at my grandma's good table. Or maybe, by then, they were listening to hear what I'd say to my mother. I pushed the bathroom door open. My mom was sitting on the toilet, bent over, crying into her hands. It was a small bathroom, only as wide as my wingspan, and my mom was heavy enough that she often told people with some mix of pride and horror that doctors considered her morbidly obese. I stepped around her, squeezed myself into a space between the toilet and the tub, then I touched her back. She spoke without looking at me. I could lose my job, she said, half whispering, half crying. My mom answered phones at a church for $9 an hour, and my dad sprayed bugs for less than that. They had no savings account, no reserve to cover whatever my love life cost them. I knew my mom was right. One disapproving preacher could bankrupt our family. Mom, I said, I'm not going to be gay anymore. I had only kissed one girl one time. Her name was Ellen. We'd been listening to Pink Floyd and drinking Jones soda in the dark when Ellen leaned toward me. My twin-sized dorm bed felt like a gulf I'd never crossed, but then the song crackled, my heart beat triple speed, and the space between us disappeared. Her lips had been so much softer than a boy's. We kissed for just a moment, not even the length of the chorus, but those few seconds felt like a revelation I wasn't sure I could forget. I told my mom I was gay a few weeks later, in church on Easter Sunday. I did not tell her about the kiss. In the bathroom, my mom cried so hard her body shook, and I racked my mind for ways to fix myself. It was 2002, the summer after my freshman year of college, and I was stuck in West Monroe, Louisiana until at least August. I wouldn't see Ellen all summer. She lived in Jackson, Mississippi, a few miles away from the private liberal arts college I was attending on scholarship. Maybe that break was long enough, I told myself. Maybe if I didn't see Ellen, maybe if I kissed the right guy, I would feel straight again. I thought suddenly of the tall teenage boy who worked alongside me Friday nights at the Blockbuster Video. Mom, I said, I'm going to date Richard from Blockbuster. He's 6'5", like Aiden in Sex and the City. My mom's nose started to run, so I pulled a few squares of toilet paper off the roll and handed them to her. I wished I could tell her about that transformative kiss. I had told my mom about every kiss since I was 14, when an exchange student from Mexico smashed his lips against my teeth during the homecoming dance. I'd come home late and beaming, and my mother had driven me straight to Waffle House, even though it was after midnight and my hairspray had stopped working. I described everything. His cologne, the way his spit had overwhelmed me, the moment he'd whispered, I love you. My mom ordered a second plate of cheese-covered hash browns and asked me what song had been playing. I told her it was Love of a Lifetime, and she slow danced with her fork toward the jukebox to see if the Waffle House had it. I told my mom about every other boy I'd kissed, 6 in the 4 years since. But watching her sob in my grandma's bathroom that 4th of July, I knew I would never tell her about the Jones soda or the Pink Floyd song. I would never tell her about the girl whose lips I imagined every night while I fell asleep. My mom cried without words or sounds, and I told her about Richard's car. It was a beat-up sedan, and his head touched the top of the sagging roof. His hands were big, and his Blockbuster uniform was so short it showed his torso. My mom listened, but she didn't say anything. I sat on the side of the bathtub. I knew she thought Satan had claimed me. She told the president of my college and any professor whose phone number she could find on the school's website that I would spend eternity in hell. She'd even persuaded a campus security guard to barge into my room periodically to make sure I wasn't doing anything gay. Aside from that one kiss, I was never doing anything gay, but it didn't matter. Just a few nights earlier, she told me that thinking of me made her want to throw up. Mom? I wanted to tell my mother that I didn't want to lose her. Not forever, not for the summer. But when she looked up, I saw that her mascara had run black rivers down her face, and I lost my will. She'd forced me to wear mascara in middle school, but I'd never learned to put it on myself, so I didn't wear it anymore. I knew she would reapply hers before we left the bathroom. She believed in makeup the way she believed in God. And I considered asking her to put some on me, too. Maybe then I thought she'd love me again. The bathroom door banged open before I could ask. My grandma stood in the entryway, wearing black slacks and a lime green V-neck t-shirt. She threw her hands up, exasperated, then she jigsawed her way into a spot near the sink. Rhonda Jean, she said, jabbing a finger at my mother. Life is a buffet. Some people eat hot dogs, and some people eat fish. She likes women, and you need to get the fuck over it. Now come eat, she said, then let herself back out. It's weird to read into the ether, although not the weirdest experience I've had. At my first book reading, I read this, and Ellen, the first girl I kissed, was in the room, and it's a weird feeling to read about someone's lips when they're looking at
you. Thank you for reading. I think it gives a little sense of the book, and that's nice for people to get. I just wanted to start by saying congratulations, because the book, it's just such a fantastic book. I love it, as you know, and it's a really complicated and big book. And so I was wondering if
nice way to put it.
What? No, it's ambitious. It's a big book. And I was wondering if you could sort of just take a minute to describe it to people. And I know that's not actually an easy ask.
Well, I think that, that has always stymied me a little bit, and it's part of why it took me so long to do it. I mean, I said that was in 2002, and it just came out a month ago. So it really took me 20 years to figure out what am I doing, and that's partially because it is about a lot of different things, and sometimes it's hard to do the elevator pitch. But essentially, what happens from here is later on that day, my grandma pulls me aside and says, I grew up across the street from a woman who lived as a man. And, this is pre-Caitlyn Jenner, pre-Laverne Cox, I think even pre-Chaz Bono. And I did not know any gay people, really. I knew like a couple online, one is here in the chat. I didn't know any trans people. Really, the only gay people I thought I knew were like Ellen DeGeneres and Elton John and my close personal friends. And so when my grandmother told me that she knew someone who I kind of assumed was transgender, it really blew my mind, because she told me that so my grandmother grew up in this little tiny town in Louisiana called Delhi. And she told me that she and Roy, this man, had lived there, and that everyone in town loved him. And it just was so different than what I knew of Louisiana at that time, because my pastor had prayed for God to kill me. My mother told me that thinking of me made her want to throw up. And so my grandma said, Roy was really important to me at one point in my life, and I lost touch with him, and I want you to go find out what happened to him. And so the book is really, on a technical level, it's just a book about me going to try to find out about Roy. But what happened along the way is I had left the South, and I had really tried to make myself tough, where I thought like the South can't hurt me anymore. And to do this project, I had to go back to the South, and that meant also going back and seeing all of my family members, being back in the places that felt really painful to me. And so the book is kind of, it's what happens as I'm reporting about Roy, which is a lot of stuff to do with my family, especially my mother. And, I really thought I was writing a book about Roy, but it turned out it's also a lot about myself and my mom.
Yeah. And a lot about writing.
It is. It's kind of like a memoir of making itself. And I kind of wanted to, like I meet a lot of young journalists now who want to be doing projects like the second they get out of college, and sometimes they'll come to me like, well, how do you get a project idea? Or how do you do like a 10,000 word magazine piece? And that did not happen for me quickly at all. I was not a good journalist when I started this book. I did not know what I was doing. And I just kind of wanted to show all of the kind of fits and starts I took along the way to be able to get to somewhere like the Washington Post. And, I was demoted twice. I was laid off once. I got told no on this project probably a dozen or more times. But all of that stuff was really useful because I was learning how to be a writer, learning how to be a reporter. And I don't think I could have done this any younger.
Right. That's like the delays make it so you become the better writer who can write the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have more questions about the journalism part of it and the reporting, because I have quite a few craft questions, because I always feel like at this point in publishing a book, it's refreshing to be asked about the writing as opposed to like.
No one has asked me about the writing at all.
That's very normal. That's like extremely normal. But first, before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about Roy. And I wanted to ask, part of the experience as you're finding this information about Roy, you are kind of seeing him through the eyes of the townspeople and the people who were in his life in this little town of, do you say Delhi?
Mm-hmm.
It's spelled Delhi, like in
Yeah,
India,
it's
but
spelled
it's
like
Delhi. So can you talk a little bit about the way Roy was perceived in the town and the way that he navigated public life there?
Well, my grandmother initially told me that it was his real identity was a secret. That's how she phrased it. He told me that he'd been kidnapped as a little girl and raised as a boy, and that everyone in town just assumed basically that she didn't have these words, but that basically he was a cisgender guy, and
Right.
that everyone thought he was great because he mowed everyone's lawns. He played country songs on his porch every night. And when I got to town and started talking to people, I realized it was more complicated than that. I think no one was really willing to be like out and out discriminatory against him or like say anything bad about him, but he did face discrimination. Pastors kicked him out of their churches because he wouldn't wear a dress, and everyone in town actually knew about the disconnect between his sex and his gender. And I think people thought that they loved him, but no one really knew him. They were
Right.
more fascinated by him, I think, but not to the point where they were willing to get to know him. He did have a couple of friends, but late in life he started to hoard cats and dogs, and so the friends that he did have really abandoned him just over the cats and dogs.
So it was
But
conditional.
yeah, and I was shocked by initially because this his best friend told me, like she didn't care at all about his gender presentation. They were best friends for like 30 years like that, but then once he got 12 dogs, she was out. And initially I was like, who abandons their best friend over this? But then I guess that's just real life, I mean, I don't know if I'd really want a best friend with 12 dogs either, but
Well, sometimes you get the best friend you get. Um,
yeah.
do you think there was a way in which the part, the way that they loved him, or I don't need to put it in quotes, the way that they loved him was also kind of a way of, I don't know, limiting their relationship with him or not letting him be a full person?
Yeah, I think most people tended to view him almost in like this childlike victim way. They they had a lot of they everyone had a different reason why they thought he was the way he was, and some of them were crazy. Like some people thought that a piece of farm equipment fell on his head and that's why he dressed as a man. One person told me that he lived as a man because when he was young his parents could not afford starch for dresses, which is a really wild theory to me. Like starch
Yeah.
went out of style at some point, and I don't think it's that expensive, but they really saw him as like, oh, this poor person in our community, or like they don't have anybody, or what a sad life. And that meant that they tended to talk to me about him in these just almost like angelic terms, and that's not how people
Mhm.
are. Even good people are have faults. Probably my favorite moment of the reporting was at some point two people who'd gone to church with me or church with him told me that they played dominoes with him often, and he was really competitive at dominoes, and if he lost he'd get so mad he'd throw the dominoes out the window. And it was just like the first time anyone told me anything real about him that was like, oh,
Yeah.
this
Or
dude gets
not agreed upon series of facts or,
yeah.
yeah. Huh.
It was just like a relief to be like, oh, okay, you had a temper and you liked regular things in life. I mean, I think one reason that I like not living in the South sometimes is that the rest of my life I can have other things about me other than being gay. Whereas sometimes I think when you're in a place like that, you're just limited to either your gender identity or your sexuality, and there's other stuff about people.
Right. It's really reductive. I was really fascinated by the ways that his gender presentation was pathologized in the way you're talking about, like, oh, it's because something fell on his head, or he was kidnapped, or she was kidnapped, these sort of stories people made up to explain it or to create these causal relationships. And I was thinking about it, and it's interesting because it's very overt, but it's a way that transgender people get talked about all the time, like in a more dominant cultural way. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
See it now, especially with people thinking that their daughters are going to school and it's a fad, and like they're being peer pressured into becoming trans. I've gotten a couple of things from people will pitch me things. Like someone just said the other day, like every child in my girl's sixth grade class is trans and they're pressuring her to be trans. And I was like, I mean, like they were suggesting that all the kids were on hormones. In sixth grade, I don't think that a doctor would prescribe that. But also, like, I was like, you do know you have to give yourself a shot for testosterone. Like, 12-year-olds aren't going to be just giving themselves shots for no reason, you know, like.
Right.
But yeah, I do think that happens a lot now, or even that's a little bit more of a political issue. But I think even before then, people would say, "Oh, well, you had a weird." This happened to me too with being gay. Like you had a weird attachment to your mother, or something
right.
to you, and like, I mean, even it's it's in the DSM of mental health issues, so that's even. I mean, that makes it to where people can get.
Which is just incredible.
But it is pathologizing even still.
Yeah, I mean, and there's like, there's those studies that come out talking about the Pied Piper explanation of, transgender children, where somebody does, there's this theory that they get led in this direction. And it's interesting to see it in the context of Roy, because it's so much more overt, but it's kind of the same dynamic, even though it's not dressed up in pseudoscientific language.
Well, he lived at a time where he did not represent a geopolitical force. Like,
right.
He was just like the guy that mowed their lawns, and like everyone was curious about him, but he wasn't, a big thing that they were scared of, or that they'd been taught to be scared of.
Right. That's not a political football, the way that being trans.
Now. It's interesting. I think in some ways, trans people have an easier time now, but in some ways, like he had an easier time because he could just go about living his life without people coming out and making a big deal of it.
Right. Because he got to be more of a person rather than an idea that somebody comes to the question with. Well, that's where I was going to ask you if there, is there a way that the South, I think that, I live in Seattle, and is there a way, like the perception of the South is more reactionary, but I was wondering if there's surprising or unconventional perspectives on that. Hi, Kat.
Yeah. Sorry, I gave him about 30 treats to see if he'd leave me alone.
It's great.
No amount of treats is enough.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be backlit. I'll see if I can kind of move a little bit.
Your question is like, is the South more complicated than?
Yes, like in what ways are attitudes in the South more complicated than maybe somebody who's a real blue state bubble person like me might think?
Well, I think people did actually take the time to get to know Roy in some ways, and they did think that they loved him, and they there was like a Pentecostal woman who fought her preacher, and another, I think it was Assembly of God, which is kind of like an offshoot of Pentecostalism, who fought another preacher, and like one of the guys that fought the preacher, he wore like a khaki work suit every day, and his explanation to me was like, when I'm buried, I want to be buried in this khaki work suit, and it's the same thing for Roy, like. He's never wore a dress, so why should he wear one now? And that was his whole understanding. Right. It's like, I want to wear my khaki work suit, and so he should get to wear whatever he wants.
Right. It's simple.
So it was more simplistic. I don't know what that man thinks now. I'd be interested to find out. That man is the only person who's still alive, I think. There was also a Pentecostal woman who was just baffled that Roy would get kicked out of church, and then yet they were complicated though, because she at some point, the Pentecostal woman, like complimented my hair, and she was like, "Your hair is really cute," and I said, "Oh, thank you," and she said, "Well, I could never wear mine like that because you're going to hell," and I was like, "Excuse me." And she was like, "Yeah, it's in First Corinthians. It says a woman's hair is her glory. I mean, hate to break." Basically, she was like, "I hate to break it to you. You look great.
Yeah, it looks really cute, but Wow.
But she said it kind of like, but then she was also still kind of working through it because her own, so Pentecostals, for those of you who don't know, they usually don't cut their hair and it gets really, really long. And she was telling, her hair was only to here. And so I was like, I think you've also cut your hair. And she was like, yeah, well, mine was falling out because it was stringy. And so I had it cut. And she was like, I just don't know, like, why, if my hair is my glory, why would God have it fall out? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, if he wants me to have it, why would he have it fall out? So she was questioning it, but then she also was barred from singing in the choir because she'd cut her hair.
Oh.
I think people were just, yeah, they were just thinking through things sometimes. And even like one big thing I took away from writing the book is I went into this, the me that I just read really believed that everyone in my family hated me. And
Mm-hmm.
I did not give them a chance to tell me otherwise, honestly. And
Yeah.
they didn't. I mean, I have a couple of them who have MAGA in their bio on Twitter, and yet they will like ask me how my dating life is going with girls. And they'll want me to be happy, and they'll like comment on like girls they think are cute for me or something. And then, um, one cousin that I wasn't that close to because I thought she was like in a Christian cult. Like I said something about being a misfit, and she wrote me a long message the other day, and it was like, I never thought of you as a misfit. I thought you were
Huh.
just like cool and went to your own drummer, and like I was just so scared that I just decided for them how they felt about me, and it took me like writing a whole book. Some of them I talked to, and like that cousin I hadn't, and she read the whole book and then reached out to me and was like, "That's all you think I hate you? I don't."
Huh.
Like, so I think it is more complicated. I mean, there's certainly um, things that are happening in the South right now. Like if you look to Texas,
Yeah.
that are really scary, and I can see why people would be afraid to have their kids there at this time. But that's not everyone in the whole state.
I was wondering when I just sort of speed reread it this afternoon, I was thinking about when you first heard about Roy when you were young, and like, what did the story mean to you then? Versus, I mean, you've spent all these years processing it now, but like when you encountered it when you were young and figuring out who you were, what did it mean?
Well, like it originally, it really was just the idea that someone somewhat like me existed. Like there was both a historical context for me and also like a
Yeah.
possible future for me because
Huh.
I really like went on LiveJournal and met online a few people, but otherwise I really didn't know anyone who was gay. Now I say that, but multiple of my friends from that time have turned out gay. So, but I just at the time didn't know
But
they
you
were
can
gay.
know.
Um, and so it was just really exciting to think like this person exists. Um, as time went on, I got really into like the kidnapping idea, and like I grew up in the '80s, and like kidnapped children was like a big theme in the '80s, like Adam Walsh, and then like baby Jessica fell down the well. So just like kids who go missing was like a huge part of my childhood, and so I had always been drawn to that narrative, and so I think I was really interested in that, and I when I really started reporting this book, I had just been demoted twice at work. And I thought, I'm going to go do a good Southern story. I really thought I'm going to sell this to This American Life, and my whole life is going to turn around. I don't know why I thought This American Life was just like waiting to hire me, but I was 25 and brazen, I guess. But and then I was there. I think for many years I had no idea what it meant to me. I just felt compelled. And I took a book writing class much later, and on the first day, the teacher said something like, "If you can do anything else at all with your time other than write this book, do it, because writing a book is really lonely. It does not pay well. Um, it's there's all kind of sadnesses that you don't know to expect. So like, if you can do anything, do it. You
Besides write any book, right?
Yeah, like it. The only reason to write a book is because you have to do it." And I think that's just that's the best way I could explain it. I didn't know why, but I just had to do it. And I can see now that I wanted to go home, but I didn't know how to go home if I wasn't working. I didn't know how to
Mm,
like go hang out with my family. And they were, I mean, they're all nosy as well, so they also wanted to know about Roy. So like at various parts in the book, different relatives of mine wind up joining my little film crew and like coming to help. They had come out to help me and stuff. And it gave us something to talk about. You know, like initially we'd just be talking about Roy, but then we'd gradually open up the conversation to talk about our lives and like our feelings on things and or recipes or whatever, you know.
yeah. That one of the questions I had, there's a, it was difficult for you to find information about Roy, right? That's part of the story, is you doing this research and kind of running against walls or hearing the same stories over and over. And I almost got this feeling as I was reading that the difficulty of the story was part of its appeal. And I wonder if that has to do with the desire to return over and over. Like, okay, I'm not gonna be able to solve this. I don't know.
Yeah, you know, when my grandmother was alive, I think I probably didn't want to finish it because
Mhm.
my grandmother and I, she's not in the book as much as she was in the real life experience of it. Like every interview I would do, I would come back to her house and tell her about it. And I wound up becoming really close with her. And I knew if I finished it, that I wouldn't have a reason to go down there. I think I also honestly knew if I finished it, she would watch it. And I was scared of that.
Right. It
Like,
was supposed to be a documentary film before it became a book. Yeah.
and I didn't know, I didn't want to know what she would think of it. And obviously, it changed a lot over time because then it became more about my mother. But I
Mm.
wouldn't have been able to do that at an earlier time.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of the book finding its form? Like first it was going to be a film, but then once you moved into it being a book, can you just talk a bit about about the subject emerged?
Yeah, so I really did want it to be a documentary, and I did not want to be in it at all. I just wanted it to be a regular documentary about this other person. And I had a director of photography who went down with me every time, and they would beg me to be in it, and I would be like, "No, I'm a newspaper journalist. We do not put ourselves in things." And they
Mm.
would like sneakily film me sometimes, or they would also, after every interview, tape me and make me say how I felt about the interview.
Oh
And
my
in
God.
most of the footage, I looked so bratty because I just did not want to do it at all.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But then it turned out to be really great to have all that contemporaneous, like, here's what you were thinking on that day. But so while I was doing that, I applied for a bunch of grants because it turns out making a documentary is super expensive.
Right.
And I was, I and my filmmaker partner, we were using our own money, but we didn't have enough to do like hire an editor or a sound mixer and stuff like that. So we were applying for grants and we just kept getting turned down. And finally, one of the people who turned me down said, I want to tell you why I turned you down. And she said, when you have a big project like this, your main character has to change over the course of the narrative arc. And your main character is dead, and you don't have enough to reconstruct any changes in his life. So that's not really a narrative. And so she was like, you need to find a different main character. And I remember I was like, what about my grandma? And she said, what about you?
Right. You're the one that needs someone else to say it. Yeah.
And I was like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
And then, so that went on years and years, and it really felt like an albatross. I would, once a year, I would like book a cabin and I would make an outline and I would buy note cards because I read that like for documentaries, people will buy note cards and like set up all the scenes on the wall. So I like taped note cards all over the walls and made my ex-spouse live like that and still couldn't figure it out. And then I got into Columbia University, and they have this really famous book writing class there where the professor, I think they've had like 100 books get published out of this class. And
Huh.
he teaches you how to write a book, and he brings in editors and agents, and he teaches you how to write a book proposal, which is a very specific kind of writing. And so it's intense class. It meets for 9 hours every Monday, and you have to read a book a week,
What?
write a book chapter a week. So I did not do I mean, I was poor anyway, so I didn't have money to do anything in New York. But if you take that class, you can't do anything else. And so you write 6 book chapters while you're in there. And
Is this through the journalism school?
yeah, it is.
Huh, interesting.
So the professor was like, why aren't you writing any of these in the first person? And again, I gave my spiel. I'm a journalist. We don't do that. And he was like, yeah, I'm also a journalist.
Yeah, it turns out
Yeah.
I too am a journalist.
He was like, I remember he with me, he said, don't act like you don't have skin in the game. And he was like, just try one. Like, there's nothing to lose. Like, you're just in this class.
Yeah.
Try writing one with you in it. And when I did, I knew it was better than anything else I had done. And I still wasn't even thinking I was going to write a book. Like, a friend of mine and like big time journalism hero, Andrea Elliott, had talked me into applying for the book writing class. And initially I was like, I don't have a book to write. And she was like, yes, you do.
Huh.
She was like, look, I've made documentaries too, but you can do things in books that you can't in documentaries. And then so I initially was like, okay, I'm just going to use this class to work out an outline for my documentary. But then once I got in, I was like, oh, right. Like, I'm better at writing than.
Yeah, right. Why not do the thing you're good at?
And it does solve some of the issues of not, like, we didn't have any video footage of Roy or anything. And so you can do more recreating in a book. And then while I was in that class, my mother died. And again, this professor comes to me and he's like, why isn't your mother in this book? And I was like, my mother has nothing to do with this. And he was like, really? I thought you said she went on one of the trips with you. And I was like, yeah, but she only went once and then she had nothing to do with it. And he was like, well, just try writing one with your mom. And I was like, you only think that because she died. Like, it's not
such an incredible character. She's just,
and then so thankfully I had taped everything. And first of all, I had told myself that my mother only went on one trip with me, but she went on multiple. And I had just blocked it out somehow.
Right. It seems that I totally get that. I want to move on to your mom, but before that, I want to pause and ask you, I don't know how many writers are in the audience, but I wanted to ask you a crafty question, which is, so you're writing these chapters for this professor at Columbia and they're coming, it's working, right? You're just writing them basically for this class. And I wanted to ask you about, working with an imaginary audience as a writer, right? So like you're used to writing for the Oregonian at this point, or places where you're dealing with this very broad audience and you're moving into what turns out to be this book that really beautifully balances, reporting with really intimate writing. And I was wondering if it helped just to have this one person to write to, or to have him or her as your imagined audience.
I think so. I think like the first ones I wrote in his class, all of those chapters were actually only like 3,000 words, and the chapters in my book are all about 7,500 words. So my understanding of how to write a book changed dramatically over time. And so I think actually I've gone back and looked at a couple of the ones I wrote for him, and they really read like newspaper articles. And some of it was really small. Like I remember one of my mentors at Columbia at some point pulled me aside and she was like, you need to write longer sentences. And I was like, no one has ever complained about my sentences before.
Yeah, my sentences are perfect.
And she was like, go read every magazine article that you told me that you loved and count how many words are in the sentences. And so I pull out Catherine Boo and probably Andrea, and I was like, oh, these are really long sentences.
Yeah.
So that one thing like revolutionized my writing, where I was like, okay, I've got to figure out how to write different sentences. And that was just on my own of like, I would just sit down and like study other people's sentences. And then I kind of did that with memoirs too, or even sometimes not memoirs. Like one book that I really studied a lot that might sound weird, but really helped me is Sharp Objects, which is a thriller, but it's similar. It's like a journalist goes home to investigate something and then her family is there. And so I would just like study.
Right. You need a model.
Yeah. I would look and I would see it wouldn't just be like jumping into the interview and here's the interview. It would be like descriptions of the drive up, descriptions of the people's home. And like, that's really, I guess, like how I learned to write a book is just like really sitting down with other people's books and being like, how did they build this out? And
Yeah.
once I did that, thankfully I had all of the video footage. I could just basically go back and re-report everything. I mean, because we would hook a camera up to the
Right.
car and film our way there. My friend would film me as we were going into the people's homes and stuff. So I had all of that stuff. Then I also had them taping me about what I thought, so I could like go in and like add in what I thought. But that doesn't really answer your audience question. But then when I actually began to write, I didn't think about an audience at all. And part of it, I think, is I was writing it during the pandemic, and it became almost, I wasn't writing it to my mother, but almost like for my own reckoning of my mother.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I had thought about anyone reading it, I wouldn't have been able to write it because I was really
So the
trying.
best audience is no audience.
Yeah, I mean, there were things in there. I was married at the time, and I had not told my spouse a lot of the things in there.
Mm-hmm.
I had not told my best friend, and if I had thought about the number of people that have reached out to me now that I knew from the past that are like, "Oh my God, I had no idea," I just would have collapsed, you know. I'm glad I did not think about that because
Yeah.
it's I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's really overwhelming to have strangers just know your business. And like
Yeah.
a guy stopped me on the street today and asked if I was me, and it was awesome to be recognized, but also a little bit awkward because I'm like, oh wow, you know a lot about me and my mom and my first kiss with a girl and maybe my marriage, maybe, you know, I don't know, like, and I don't know what he knows.
When do I get the dossier on you?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a weird dynamic, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. But selfishly, I want to go back and ask you something that you alluded to really quickly. You said when you started writing longer sentences, your writing changed. And I want to know what longer sentences allowed you to do that you couldn't do with shorter sentences.
Well, the way that she initially described it to me is it allows people to really like settle in. And we were talking about the New Yorker initially when we were talking about this, and she said, look, nobody opens up a New Yorker article hoping to speed through it. They know they're like, it's Sunday morning, they're going to sit there for an hour, and they want to just like, I think she actually even described it as like, think about how you tell a story when you're talking, Casey. Like Southerners are really languid. They, you know, they're adding a billion details in, and you're like, hang out with me here for a little bit. I promise I'm going somewhere.
Right, we're gonna get there.
Yeah, but my sentences before were like, this happened, and then this happened. And like I, you know, didn't even use conjunctions or anything like that. And I think I was just like, here's all of the action, in and out. But when you have those longer sentences, and not every sentence is long, I mean, you gotta vary it up, but I think it allows you, I don't know, I think it allows you to like sink deeper into the story and really be in the place. It's very much like a book about a place, and so some of those longer sentences I think are like descriptions of, I don't know, I think it slows you down in a way that maybe allows you to take some of the stuff. I mean, there is some like really intense stuff in the book, and if you just got pile drive with it, it might be hard to take. And there's a couple places where I just do things. There's like one paragraph in there about my mother that is everything
That's
good
very,
about her. And
I know the paragraph you mean. Well, yeah.
It is more like that, but I don't, there's some that I couldn't, you know, do.
Well, and there's a balance thing too. You know, if you're just bringing that in one paragraph, then suddenly it has this power because it's set within these other different kinds of sentences. I want to let people know that they can put any questions in the Q&A, and I'll come around to them in a little bit when I'm done peppering you with questions about sentences. Another thing that's really stunning about the book from a writing point of view, you know, you're talking about, there's a lot of constructed scenes in the book. You're obviously a really brilliant, you know, a lot of being a really good memoirist is actually being a good reporter. It's like knowing that scenes are important, knowing how to embed the reader in the scene and make them be there. And there's a lot of scenes that, you know, you've talked about using the footage that you had to inform the writing of those scenes, right? You have actual raw material, but there's also extended, really, really detailed scenes with dialogue, I will add, in the book that are constructed from memory. And I was wondering if you could talk about doing that and how you navigated that dynamic. As a teacher, that's probably the dynamic student writers of memoir have the hardest time with, when they're constructing dialogue from memory, because it's kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of facing the fact that maybe you're making it up a little bit because you're putting words in someone else's mouth.
I think one way to do it in a book like this, where you have both, is to be really clear where you have video footage. So that it's obvious, like, these are the ones that are verifiable. And there are a couple places where like, there's one from my high school years where I say something like, in my memories of that night, she said, "You're going to make so much more of your life than I did." To try to, like, allude to the idea that this is what I remember, but it might not be what she said. But there is dialogue from my mother's younger life that, so some of the ones that are like reconstructed, I have journals for. So I have kept a journal since I was in 5th grade, and I have them all. And that is really great to have. And again, like, and sometimes when I was going to them, I was like, "Oh, your life wasn't as bad as you thought." And then I, like, read some of them. I was like, "Oh my God, it was worse." So I was able to get some of it from there because my journals were really detailed, because when I was younger, I didn't have a ton of friends. And so I think I just, like, was writing down what everybody said all the time. But for the ones with my mom, I would always try to interview as many people as possible who could, and ask them what they remember. And in the ones about my mom, like, I know how she talks, and
right,
you want to capture that. I mean, that's one thing I find really hard in journalism. I try not to do reconstruction very much because when you're doing the Washington Post, like, you want to be really accurate. Like, we stake our foundation on that. And you can't be with reconstruction unless there's video or something. Right. You can get 2 people to see if they agree on something, but we know how we talk. And sometimes when you look at something, you don't know what you did say, but you would never say it the way that person said you said it. Like, that's just... Yep. Like, somebody quoted me once, and they said that I said the word crappy, which is just a word I would never use. Like, I don't know what I did say, but I just know I didn't say crappy, And so I wanted the people who would appear in my book to, if they see dialogue, to be like, yeah, that's how I talk. And I didn't give dialogue to anyone whose language I don't know, but, like, my mom had, like, a particular Southern way of talking, and I know her words, and some of it I just remember because the chapter I'm thinking about, chapter 4, that's about her, those are probably my most vivid memories of life. And maybe I have the words a little bit wrong, but I think the feeling is just so strong in me. I think probably because it was a really traumatizing time, and it just got really grooved in there. But a lot of times I either was running, even in my own personal life when I wasn't reporting, I run a phone all the time taping people, and I don't do it as much now, but I think I did it a lot as a coping mechanism of, if I think of my life as a story, I'm going to be able to get through it, because all of this pain is just narrative tension, and eventually I'm going to make something. Actually, one of my friends is on here, Lamar. I just found an old article the other day or an old email, and I was like, my email fights with Lamar got deleted, and I'm so mad because those would have made a good book someday. I think our email fight was going to be a good book, but I was distraught even then, because I was like, I was going to use this at some point.
I was saving this. Well, so the chapter you're talking about, it's really reductive to say it's about your mother's abuse of you, but that's what it is. But the story of your mother blossoms in these really weird and, sometimes not wonderful and sometimes wonderful ways. And it's a really, really complex portrait. and I was very moved by it. And I was wondering if the responses to the writing about your mother have been surprising to you.
Well, I'm in therapy to try to say more nice things about myself, so I'm just gonna be honest. When I wrote that chapter, I knew it was good. Like,
It's really good.
I was like, I did this. This to me, it might be the best chapter in the book, and not what I was setting out to do when I started the book. But I'm just like, I know, because yeah, it's not just about my mother. It's about Pentecostalism. It's about the '80s oil bust in Louisiana. It's about what it means to be a teenage parent, what it means to be military, what mental illness is.
It's about poverty.
Poverty, yeah. And it, for being about all those things, I think it's about 6,000 words, so it's decently contained. And I felt good about it. I did not expect, though, that my mother would be the main thing people would want to talk about. Even though I thought that was the best chapter.
Said every memoirist who ever published a book on any subject. Like, everyone always wants to talk about your mother.
Roy, but I'm happy. It seems like most people have that reaction that you just said, that they see her as both good and bad, and above anything, just really alive. And for the people who were in here that knew her, like, she really was. She was so charismatic, sometimes in bad ways. But she was, and like, I don't think I could ever write to capture her as she truly was, but I think I've done at least a somewhat decent job, because it's
that scene when you're in Jackson at the lip sync.
That's my second favorite.
I love that scene where she's making friends with everyone. She's making friends with all the people in this gay bar, and like, they're worried that their mother wouldn't accept them the way yours has accepted you. So there's all this like layers of irony, and she's making friends, and you're sitting there with like your little napkin scribbling down notes, stars brighter in Jackson, and this disembodied floating head of a writer, this very observer, and she's just out there living, and you're watching. It's an incredible scene. It's so moving. And dance together.
I taped that one too, and so it was, when I went back to listen to it, some of it was really heartbreaking, and then some of it was interesting to hear yourself sometimes, because I can hear how wooden and awkward I sound as I'm talking to people, and just how nervous. And I was only nervous. I mean, so for context, for y'all who don't know, this scene takes place the day that the Mississippi legislature had decided that you could be kicked out of anywhere, including the doctor's office, for being gay or trans. And what I was scared of that night was not being discriminated against, but was being close to my mom. And also, like, the people, there was the group of these people who were like performing to fight this bill, and they just all seemed so brave to me. And I think that was the moment in my life where I realized, like, everything I had given up leaving the South, because I was scared and I felt pained by the South, but I also lost a ton in leaving, and I don't think I'll ever get over that. And I think that was the moment where I had been telling myself for years, I don't care about the South. I left, like, I'm happy in Portland, Xanadu. And that moment was where I realized, like, because I said to some of the lesbians, I was like, why don't you leave? You wouldn't have to deal with this in Portland. And one of the lesbians was just like, F that. I get to have my state, and they have to take me. She was like, I love it here. Like, it's warm 8, 9, 10 months of the year.
It doesn't rain.
Yeah, like, why would I go up there? Like, and that's a chapter that I actually wrote in that class, where I was like, oh, okay. Like, that chapter is the one that I think I knew would be the book. It doesn't happen till like chapter 16 or something, but I knew, like, that's where I wanted to be working up toward.
Right, and it had that way of having the storytelling's really intimate, but there's all, just like you were saying about chapter 4, there's all these different other forces kind of flowing into this intimate moment in a way that's really effective. It's also so interesting, like this idea of there's the way that you write these women or these people in the bar, there's a heroism, you know, that you're seeing in them, and then that's sort of reflected onto Roy, and it's really beautiful. That's just a compliment, not a question.
There's a trans woman who sings Shania Twain's "Man, I Feel Like a Woman," and it was one of the most amazing moments of my life. It was heartbreaking and also just stunningly brave. At the end, she ripped her wig off and just stood on stage and cried and let the audience see her. And this is 2016, so like North Carolina had its bathroom bill, but that was pretty much all that was going down. Like there wasn't the big concerted effort that there is now, but North Carolina was like this harbinger where you could see something bad is about to start happening in this country for trans people. And
yeah,
and I felt that night with that woman standing on stage and just being like, here is my pain, and I'm not letting any of you look away from it, and I'm not leaving this state. Yeah, I think about it all the time.
Yeah, that's a great scene. I'll ask one more sort of crafty question, or maybe a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up the Q&A. So whenever you talk to writers, they always have the same question, or it's always couched in different ways, but like, what did your family think of this is what they ask, is what readers ask. But what writers want to know is like, how did you write about real people? Did you have like an ethics or a way you did it? Or how did you set it up in your brain so that you could do it, right? I had a very specific way that I did it when I wrote both my books, where I was going to say this and not say this, or I had parameters. And I'm wondering if you had something, if you had to work that out for yourself. Like for me, I started writing my first book and I was really just writing very nice things about all the people in my life. And my then husband said, if you only write nice things about nice people, you're not writing a memoir, you're writing a newsletter. And I think that
send it out at Christmas.
Right, exactly, with a good photo. So how do you kind of get past that hump of only writing nice things about nice people? Like I had a specific strategy, and I'm wondering what yours was.
Mine was avoidance, and
Yeah, well, I had that one too.
I had some things that I did not reveal, where I just decided these are too painful, and it's not mine. It might have affected me, but it's not the point of the story, and I'm not going to talk about them. And I let my brother read it first because I just really didn't want the book to do any harm to my little brother, and I let one of my cousins who went on the trip with me, I let him read it because it does obliquely describe his mom as well. But I did not let any of my aunts read it, and I fact checked some things with them, but I did not say, here's how you're going to appear. And then, so when you write a book, you turn it in, and then it doesn't come out for a year. And then I said earlier, I didn't think about who was going to read it when I was writing it, but then in that year, that's all I thought about. And
right. There's the dark nights of the soul once it's in the in between.
Yes. And I started thinking, oh my God, is my aunt going to be mad that I said this about her? And I was just thinking about one specific aunt, but there's another aunt in the book that I had not heard from in 4 years, so I just assumed she wouldn't read it. And the day that it came out, she got it, that she had it like pre-ordered it, and she read it all in one day and like immediately contacted me. And immediately she was like, her first thing was like, you said I had 4 husbands and I only had 3.
How could you?
I know, and I was like, I'm sorry. And then there's some other stuff. One really painful thing is, so her son died at 32, and I don't know why he died. And I wrote in the book like what she had told me is the reason he died, and then I wrote in there also what my brother told me the reason he died was, and they're contradictory. And so she wrote me this long message, and she was like, the truth is nobody knows how Charlie died, and there's also a part in there where I'm kind of skeptical of some things my aunt says. Like a cop comes to the house and she tells them that she works for Homeland Security, and I was like, I don't believe you. And she wrote to me, she's like, I did work for Homeland Security, but look, I don't blame you. I blame your mother because your mom told you lies about me. And I was like, well, my mom didn't tell me these things, but I started to kind of unpack it with her a little bit of like, why do I distrust my family members? And the reason is I distrust my mother.
Right.
And yeah, I was projecting my feelings about my mother onto her, but she wasn't really that hurt by it. She was just like, I'm proud of you for writing this book. Here's a couple things you got wrong, but she wasn't angry with me. She actually immediately sent me a diamond painting set, which I don't know what that is exactly. But he was like, "Here's a gift for your book coming out. Diamond
Oh, that's so
popular.
nice.
I want you to get into it. Maybe I should get into it.
You absolutely 100% should get into it. No question.
Stay tuned for my next book on diamond painting. But
Yeah. Watch this space. Should we have a couple audience questions? Or I think, aha. Oh yeah, this is a great question, straightforward. Casey, can you comment on your path to publishing, the agent process? And Suzanne says, loved this book. Thanks for writing such a tremendous memoir.
thank
Tremendous
you.
is a good word.
So Claire and I actually have the same agent who I think we might both be biased in thinking is just like the coolest person ever.
She really is. She's terrifyingly cool.
She's actually like intimidatingly cool. But so when I took this book writing class, my professor offered to write her for me. She had just been the agent on that book, Educated by Tara Westover, and he was like, I think this is who you should get. So I'm going to write to her on your behalf. And then also another professor of mine oddly went to high school with this agent. Her name's Anna Stein. So she's like, I'll write to her too. And this agent is amazing at email. So usually I got a really privileged path in on this, but usually what you would do for an agent is send like 2 sentences. Like you'll find a book that you like and you think is like your book, go to the back, see who they thanked as their agent, right. Write that agent like a 2-sentence query to see if they want to read your book proposal. I got to bypass that because these other people wrote to her for me. So she's like, send me your book proposal. And I sent it to her, and I guess she's just a really fast reader as well because she called me a day or 2 later, and a book proposal is like 100 pages long. She called me a day or 2 later, and at the time, I did not have Roy's diaries. So, for those of you who don't know, the very first trip I go on, someone tells me that Roy kept a diary every day of his life and that his neighbor has all of them. And I asked for 10 years, and the neighbor told me every year for 10 years, no, I'm not giving them to you. And so she calls me back, and we talked on the phone for a long time, and I loved her. Like, she was telling me that she thought Dolly Parton was gay. And so I was like, this is who I want. And we just like had a good time talking. And at the end, she was like, listen, like, I think you're a really good writer, but if you don't have these diaries, you don't have a book. And I'm sorry I can't represent you. And I was so heartbroken because I just liked her so much. But we said goodbye. 6 months goes by. And then I had a story in the New Yorker, and probably like 4 or 5 agents reached out to me to ask if I wanted representation. And I talked on the phone to all of them, and all of them treated me in this way that was like, ooh, you're a poor Southern lesbian. I can sell that. And that was never how Anna talked to me. And I just felt kind of gross talking to some of them. So I emailed her back, and I was like, look, I do not have the goods, but I need an agent because I have to make this book, and I like you more than anyone else. Is there any chance you'll reconsider? And she said, okay, I will take you on, but you have to go back one more time and ask. And I'll let you see if that worked or not. But then, so from there, she edited the book proposal a little bit, and then she sends it out to publishing houses with kind of like a letter that she writes about me. And she's very well respected, so that really goes a long way. Like, when you're choosing your agent, you do want someone that has a reputation because that's going to get people to email her back. And they also, I think, people just really trust her taste. So you want someone whose books you really admire. Like, it isn't just that you want to get just anybody. So for mine, there were 8 publishers who said yes. And then what happens from there is you talk on the phone to each of those publishers, and then they ask you questions. They kind of tell you what their vision is for it. And they're all over the map. Like, people have different ideas of what they want your book to be. And then it goes to an auction where they do 2 things. They tell you how much money they'll give you, and then they also kind of write you a letter that's like, some of it's like kind of like a fan letter of like what they'll do for you. And some of it is just like, here's the marketing that we'll do for your book. So the bids that came back from my book ranged from 15,000 to 300,000. So
Wow.
all over the map. And I actually didn't pick the highest one. I took less money than that, but because the highest one was more of a commercial printing house that did like Tori Amos's memoir and stuff like that I just didn't think I would fit in. So it kind of they go back and forth for a while, and then it got down to 2, and the other one was like a smaller publishing house that Anna really liked a lot, and they offered less money, and she was kind of inclined to go with that one still, because if you're at a smaller publishing house, you might get more attention, you might get more marketing. Like Knopf is going to put out tons and tons of books.
Right.
Whereas like a smaller one maybe is only going to put out like 20. And so each of those 20 people is going to get a ton of attention. So if you're trying to publish a book, don't think I have to get to Random House, because Random House might not actually be the best place for you.
Right.
But I did pick the bigger one. But having a good agent is really cool, because she called Knopf back and she was like, I just don't know if I want Casey to go there because she might get lost at Knopf. Is there anything you can do? And they upped their bid by $75,000. And like,
yeah, she has a very, I don't know, she's a cool customer for sure. And she's very on it. As you can tell from your story, she's very, very, very honest, which is a really great quality in an agent.
Mm-hmm. But somebody told me over time, you'll wind up talking to your agent way more than your editor. So you want it to be someone that you want to talk to on the phone a lot. And I am still intimidated by her, but she is someone I would always want to talk to on the phone, and like someone I would trust, someone whose taste I trust.
Yeah.
You want to be able to look dumb in front of those people so that you don't look dumb in front of everybody else. And she's not going to let you go out looking dumb, not with her attached to it at all.
Yeah, not with her name on it. Okay, I'm gonna move along to another question. We have a few. Roni writes, Casey, some emerging writers like me have written a lot already, but not much about our LGBTQ plus issues. What advice do you have for us? When I write and share, it feels like coming out over and over again to different people each time.
I mean, it is, I do think it is more emotional than people sometimes acknowledge. And like, if you have a job where you're not doing that all the time, it can feel hard. Like, I'm kind of nervous about it with my job. Like, I cover trans issues, and I don't want people to think they're not going to get like a fair journalist, or like, I'm scared like people might, like people who don't like my stories might go get my personal details and do something with them, or I think you have, for me, the way that I persuaded myself to do it is I felt like I was willing to sacrifice myself and my privacy in service to what I thought was an important story to tell, which is, I think, is a story about LGBTQ rights. And like, there are times though where I kind of got hamstrung. So like, there's some things in there about romantic relationships, and I kind of painted them overly rosy. I did the newsletter version because I wanted to come off as a good gay, and I thought like, if I say anything in here is complicated, people are going to think like, oh, you didn't deserve to get married. Roll back, oh, Burgerfell. Right. And I was just scared of that, and I wound up reading In the Dream House after I wrote my book, and I think it is insanely good, like one of the best books I've ever read. But she has something in there where she talks about gay people deserve villains too, and like, we will not have fully arrived until we don't have to be perfect. Right. And it just blew me away, and I wish I had read it before so I could have gone through, because I was just really hard on myself. But I think you have to believe that it's worth it, because it's going to be painful. And I think also just admitting to yourself that it's going to be painful is important. And like, if you can't do it, it's okay. But if you think you can, I think it's good to have a support system that you can withdraw into. And if you do ever need someone just to talk to about it, I know we're in a limited time here. I'm very easy to find on the internet. You can certainly write to me, and I'm happy to talk more about it.
That's fantastic. And I feel like I really like how you're just kind of affirming Roni's experience of this, and you don't need to solve it. Like, yes, it's going to be hard. And if you can kind of just, I like that advice of focusing on the bigger project of the work that you're doing.
Sometimes I'm not a good newspaper journalist because this is my approach to life. I'm like, yeah, this can't be solved. Like, it just sucks.
Yeah, right. That is, yeah. I was like, okay, I'll just read you then. This is a long comment alert, so prepare yourself. Jesse says, it's interesting that you say that about looking for models for the structure of your book. Your book feels very queer to me in the sense that it's such a complex intertwining of memoir, investigative reporting, and archival research. It feels like you're chasing Roy and constantly being dismayed at running into yourself. Had this ever happened to you as a reporter before pursuing this project? Has the experience of filming and writing the book changed how you write in your day job? I'm thinking about the sections of the book, like where you describe the gentrification of the neighborhood you were planning to move into. Yeah.
I had not had this experience before in my day job. I mean, I thought of this book for a long time as my epic failure, and I had not felt like I had failed like that in my day job, and everything was very contained. I think the stories I'm doing now are a little bit back to being contained because I'm at the Washington Post now. But before I started working at the Post, I was freelancing for the New Yorker and New York Times magazine, and writing a book definitely influenced how I did those because there's a lot more space to do some of that stuff. I would say one thing it really taught me to do more. My early stories at the Oregonian, my best friend, who's a great editor, would read them for me, and her main edit was always, this story needs a stronger narrator. And I never could figure out how to do that. I just did not want to insert myself. And I don't insert myself in my Washington Post stories. You're not going to find my name or first person. But I think writing this book taught me how to be a better narrator and just like say what something means, or just like trust that I have researched the hell out of an issue and that I can say, this is what's happening. And because I do think even in newspaper articles, it's better reading for someone to just say, hey, this is what this means, and here's what you should know, in a more like conversational style, rather than just like list all the facts as dry as possible and hope you get the takeaway.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of hard to explain without
No, without having an example in front of you. Can you talk a little bit about, I like the way this question brings up the issue of queer archiving and like the impulse toward archiving that informs this book?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many queer stories that have been lost to time, and I've gotten a couple of comments like on Goodreads and stuff where people are like, there wasn't enough information about Roy to do this book. And I was like, would you have preferred me not to do anything? I mean, like, you know, the only way we'll preserve that history is if we do it ourselves, and it's painstaking. Like, it's, you can't just go to the library, or you can't just Google some people, because the way our country works, like the lives of the powerful are the ones that get documented, and most people don't leave behind huge, deep records of their lives. They just live and then they're gone, and their accomplishments are day-to-day accomplishments. They're not front page news. And so I do think, I mean, maybe that'll change now that people have had social media and stuff, but Roy is not the only Roy. Even I just did a story on the CPS investigations in Texas, and one of the comments underneath was like, "Oh, I lived in rural Texas in the 1940s, and my neighbor was a trans man. Like, they've always been around." And like, I want to know, I was like, who is that guy? You know?
You're like, well, call me up. Yeah. Yeah.
I got 20 years to spare, but Roy that I knew about, but there were tons of others, and some of them did get a little bit of acclaim, but thinking of Billy Tipton in Spokane.
Right. That's
though his acclaim only came after he died, and it was very, you know, ignominious. But if you do hear about these people in your lives, I think it's great to record them while you can. I mean, one person who wrote to me who read my book was an 89-year-old lesbian in Idaho who had been with her partner for 65 years, but they never came out because they were too scared. And her partner died last year, and she decided, I'm 88, I'm coming out. And like, so she's out now, and she told me she has two queer friends now. They're both college students. And like, I want to go, I kind of want to see if the Post will let me go to Idaho and write about
Absolutely.
her. And like, I don't know exactly what the pitch would be, but like, we need that. Like, I don't want that lady to die without like someone writing down, what it was
I,
like all these years.
yeah, I really loved what you said at the beginning of this answer about this Goodreads person saying that there wasn't enough material about Roy to write a book. And it's like, well, so it's like that's a critique that many people are going to run across when they're trying to tell these stories, because they were so hidden and because these stories are untold. And it's interesting how the critique kind of doubles down on the silencing, and sort of that's just going to be part of the gig of telling these stories.
My professor that I talked about, that whom I love, like, his first response to me when I applied to be in the class was, what is significant about Roy? Like, can you really do a 60,000? Is there anything interesting about him other than just his identity? Like, how are you
Yeah,
going to get 60,000 words off that? And I don't think he was being crass. He's just someone who has seen people try to sell books. So he's trying to
right.
stop me before I get too in the painful process. But I think that is, you could run into that as you try to sell a book. And
Yeah. Well, I think kind of taking that idea and turning, sort of thinking about like, well, that's a feature of the book, actually, is this pursuit of something that's elusive. I mean, I think that's part of why your book's so brilliant, is because it does exactly that. I'm going to read this one just because I have to. It's from Sadie. She says, instead of a question, I have gushing praise. I'm just so very proud of you, Casey, baby. I can barely stand it. You're brilliant, and I always knew you would do amazing things.
the first person I told I was gay. So I was a Sadie and another friend.
That's
And
very
they responded well, so it was a great foundation for being able to live the rest of my life. They just piled on top of me and hugged me and cried, and ideally everyone has that. Even if you're in a really hard place, you have two people that say I love you anyway, or not anyway, but like I love you, period.
yeah. Jared says, I loved listening to the book on audio. Listening to you read your own story was especially meaningful. My question is, what was that experience like? Did you enjoy it? What were the challenges of that process?
Recording an audiobook is so physically hard. I did not expect that. My throat hurts so bad after the first day. It's 8 hours a day for 8 days. And I try to do like deeper voices for the men to kind of like differentiate them. It's
Mhm.
so hard.
Yeah.
You don't get any training, so that's also freaky. They just stick you in the booth and say, go get them. But I was glad I got to do it because I had spent so much time with the tape that I remember how people said things, and like it was, they're not full on impressions, but like I tried to say things in the same cadence that I remember people saying things. And actually on Amazon, at least, the audiobook has outsold the hardcover book. And I've heard from a lot of people who have dyslexia or kids and like don't necessarily have time or ability to read a regular hardback book, and are instead like listening to it while they wash dishes or take walks or, you know, put people down for baths and stuff. And so I'm glad that it's out there. I had no idea how popular audiobooks were, but
Yeah.
I'm glad I got the chance to do it.
That's very cool. Okay, well, we'll finish up with one last question from Hill, and then we'll return to Roy for the last question, which I think is nice. Hill says, I was really struck by the interview with Archie, and was left wondering how you made sense of the affection he had for Roy versus the anger he had toward his lesbian neighbor. Was it because Roy is seen as non-sexual, has no partner? Was it misogyny? How often did you encounter this kind of dichotomy, kindness for Roy, and animosity toward other queer people? It's a great question.
That, I think, was the second most heartbreaking moment of the whole reporting experience. First would probably be when someone told me that some boys held Roy down and took off all of his clothes. But Archie is the guy who was the I want to be buried in my khakis. He had fought the pastor for Roy to be able to still go to church there. But as you said, like at the end of our interview, he sorry about my cat. At the end of the interview, he started making fun of his lesbian neighbor, and he just all out trash talked her, and I my heart just sank. Like this was, I honestly, my grandfather had died right before I did this interview, and the whole time I was thinking like, this guy could be my surrogate grandfather. Like he is an amazing person. And then he said all of those things, and I realized, A, he must not realize that I'm gay, and B, I better get out of here before he does.
Mm.
It was painful, and I think I hadn't really thought about why, but I think you're probably right. Like it probably is because Roy didn't have partners. Roy was not seen as a sexual being. I think people really just saw Roy as a child, even though he lived to be 80. I don't think they saw him as a full human, and they saw him as someone to pity. That said, Archie also grew up with Roy since they were babies. Like they slept on cotton sacks in the fields together. So it could be some of that, that he had known Roy for a long time and had been conditioned this other way. But yeah, I mean, it gets back to something Claire said earlier. Like people aren't just one thing, and sometimes the other thing that they are is horrifying and depressing.
Well, we'll end on that note.
I told you, it's always sunny with me. Like you're just gonna get, you're gonna get horrifying and depressing when you come around my way.
That's right. I think that it is a 90 minutes and a good amount of time to devote to a monumental book.
Thank you. It went really fast with your great questions.
Oh,
It's fun to listen to you. I know I had to do more of the talking, but you have really good questions. And I haven't gotten to talk about any of that stuff, so it made it feel new and fun.
it was great to hear.
Thank you everyone for who stayed and visited. It's nice to see people that I knew from so long ago in here.
Yeah, I'll second to what Casey said. Thank you so much, Claire, for coming and bringing questions and really sort of generating this conversation. And Casey, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I think it'll be a really impactful book. And thank you to everyone who came in the audience and asked really engaging questions. I think this was a wonderful discussion. Anyone who registered for this event will get a follow-up email with a link to watch the recordings. There's lots that was talked about here tonight, and you'll be able to check it again. I just dropped in the chat there a link to pick up the book, Diary of a Misfit. It's a great way to support Casey and her writing, as well as Firestorm in our bookstore. So hope if folks haven't picked up a copy yet, they will. Yeah, so again, thank you both so much for taking time to be with us tonight, and hopefully we'll see you again somewhere down the line.
Thanks. I think Claire has a new book coming out next year.
Next year, April. Yeah.
Okay.
Sigh. Yeah.
We'll have to be in touch.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch. That's right.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, y'all. Have a good day now.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.